Part 1, The Misunderstood Giant. April 1943. The skies over war-torn Europe groan under the weight of thunder. Engines roar. Tracers cut across the clouds like fiery veins. The air smells of cordite and burning oil, the signature scent of a continent at war. High above the gray overcast, a new shape emerges from the horizon. It is not sleek like the Spitfire, nor graceful like the Messerschmitt. It is huge, almost absurdly so, a hulking mass of aluminum and fire, with broad elliptical wings and a nose dominated by a spinning, steel-toothed engine. From below, it looks like a flying barrel. From the side, a thunderhead with wings. Its name, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. When German pilots first caught sight of it, they laughed. To them, it seemed a mistake, an engineer's overindulgence, an aircraft too heavy to climb, too bulky to turn, too ungainly to threaten the Luftwaffe's deadly ballet of Messerschmitts and Focke Wulfs. In their ready rooms, they mocked it. It's not a fighter, it's a flying beer keg. Let them bring more of these fat birds, we'll shoot them down before they reach altitude. And for a moment, they were right. Early Thunderbolts struggled to climb as fast as German interceptors. They consumed fuel like monsters. Their complex turbochargers failed under stress, their pilots battled fumes, vibration, and endless mechanical quirks.
But beneath that armor, beneath that oversized radial engine, something dangerous was waiting to be unleashed. Hidden inside this overweight brute was an 18-cylinder heart, the Pratt & Whitney R 2800 Double Wasp, one of the most powerful piston engines ever built. It didn't purr like a Spitfire's Merlin. It growled a deep metallic thunder that shook the air. And when that engine met the skill of a determined American pilot, bold, untested, and hungry to prove himself, the laughing stopped. Because the P-47 was not built to dance. It was built to kill. It could dive faster than anything else in the sky, faster than the Luftwaffe ever imagined possible. Its 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns could tear a bomber in half, shred tanks, or turn a formation of enemy fighters into twisted wreckage. This was not an elegant duelist. This was a brawler, a heavyweight in a world of featherweights. It didn't dodge, it absorbed. It didn't evade, it attacked. And once it entered a dive, not even gravity itself could stop it. Soon, the laughter would fade into static radio calls, panic and silence. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, the day would come when the black cross on their wings would be seen not by prey, but by predators. And at the center of this storm, roaring through the flak and tracer fire, was a Jug, the Thunderbolt, an aircraft that would turn ridicule into respect and fear into legend.
Part 2, The Birth of a Behemoth. The story begins long before the skies of Europe turned black with smoke, in a quiet corner of Long Island, New York. There, in the modest offices of the Republic Aviation Company at Farmingdale, a handful of engineers were working on a dream. It was the late 1930s, and the world's air forces were still trapped by tradition. Fighters were small, agile, almost delicate things, machines that lived and died by maneuverability. The British had their Spitfires, the Germans, their Messerschmitts. Each a fencing blade in the sky. But America's own aircraft, the P-30SIXS, the P-40s, were already falling behind. They were fast enough, but their engines gasped at high altitude. Their guns were light, their armor thin, and their range barely enough to cross a state line, let alone an ocean. And into this conservative world stepped a man who thought differently. Alexander Kartveli, born in Tbilisi, Georgia, trained in Europe, exiled by revolution, had seen what the future of warfare demanded. To him, air combat was no longer a gentleman's duel. It was a war of endurance, speed, and overwhelming firepower. He believed a fighter should not be fragile. It should be unstoppable. Kartveli envisioned a new breed of aircraft, one that could take hits, climb into the stratosphere, and bring the fight to the enemy on its own terms. Not a fencer's blade, but a warhammer. When the U.S. Army Air Corps issued its request in 1940 for a new high-altitude escort fighter, most designers offered improved versions of existing planes, modestly faster, slightly lighter, marginally better. Kartveli tore up the rulebook. His idea was almost heretical: build a fighter around the engine, not the other way around. At the heart of his proposal was the Pratt & Whitney R 2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder, twin-row radial engine capable of delivering 2,000 horsepower. It was an engine so large that it barely fit inside conventional airframes. But to Kartveli, that was exactly the point. If it's too heavy, he said, make the wings stronger. If it's too powerful, build the fuselage to match. Let the pilot ride the engine, and give him guns enough to win the war. The result was a design so audacious it shocked the Air Corps Review Board. It was called the XP-47B, and it looked like no fighter before it. With its wide, elliptical wings and massive propeller spinner, it appeared more bomber than fighter. At over 17,000 pounds fully loaded, it was almost twice the weight of the Curtiss P-40 or the British Spitfire. Its fuselage was so large, engineers joked you could park a Ford sedan inside it. But Kartvel's monster was not built for beauty. It was built for power. To feed the engine's enormous appetite for air, Kartveli designed a turbo-supercharger system that filled the entire rear fuselage, a labyrinth of ducts, turbines, and intercoolers that compressed thin air at 30,000 feet into a torrent of oxygen-rich fury. This innovation alone would give the Thunderbolt an edge unmatched by any other Allied fighter, full power at extreme altitude. It was a technological marvel, and a maintenance nightmare. Mechanics would later curse its complexity, tracing pipes and valves like veins through a living creature. But without it, the Thunderbolt would never have reached the heights that made it legendary. When the prototype was finally rolled out in the spring of 1941, the engineers stood back in silence. It was massive, heavy, and somehow beautiful, in the way a storm is beautiful.
On May 6, 1941, Republic's test pilot Lowell Smith climbed into the cockpit of the XP-47B for its maiden flight. The engine roared to life with a deep, throaty growl that shook the hangars. The aircraft lumbered down the runway, its landing gear groaning under the weight. Observers watched nervously. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built. At the far end of the field, Smith pulled back on the stick. The giant hesitated, then, almost reluctantly, it lifted off the ground. Once airborne, everything changed. The Thunderbolt surged forward with raw, muscular power. Smith pushed it higher. 10,000 feet, 20,000, then 40,000. The engine didn't falter. The controls were steady. The massive wings held firm. And when Smith leveled out and squeezed the trigger, the air erupted. 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns thundered in unison, spitting streams of lead at 800 rounds per minute each. 13 rounds per second per gun, over 100 bullets per heartbeat. The recoil shook the entire airframe, but the Jug didn't flinch. It was as if the aircraft itself enjoyed the violence. Down below, the engineers could barely contain their smiles. The XP-47B was not just flying, it was dominating the air. Kartveli's philosophy had been vindicated. He had created something that defied all expectations, an aircraft that didn't dance around its opponents. It crushed them. If you can't outturn the enemy, Kartveli would later say with grin, then outrun him, outdive him, and outgun him. That philosophy, raw, aggressive, and unapologetically American, would soon echo across every airfield in Europe. The Thunderbolt had been born, and the world's greatest air war was about to meet its loudest, heaviest, most unforgiving warrior.
Part 3, Early Skepticism. By the summer of 1942, the Republic factory floor in Farmingdale was alive with sound, the hammering of rivets, the crackle of welding arcs, the throaty cough of test engines coming to life. The XP-47B had proven the concept. Now came the real test, mass production and combat deployment. When the first production P-47B Thunderbolts rolled out to American fighter groups, excitement quickly turned into hesitation. For many pilots, the first sight of the Thunderbolt was intimidating. They had grown up with the graceful lines of P-40s and P-39s, slim, agile machines that responded like extensions of the body. The P-47, by comparison, looked like a monster. A brute of riveted steel and thick aluminum skin, towering over the flight line like some industrial beast. Its landing gear were wide and muscular, its nose a massive spinning disc of metal surrounding a thundering radial engine. It was, as one pilot muttered under his breath, less of a fighter, and more of a flying bulldozer. Compared to the nimble Spitfires of the Royal Air Force, or the emerging P-51 Mustangs still in prototype form, the P-47 seemed archaic, oversized, heavy, and inelegant. Its cockpit sat high atop the fuselage like a turret, its thick wings hiding miles of fuel lines, coolant ducts, and gun bays. When new recruits approached their aircraft for the first time, many craned their necks upward and said the same thing. How the hell is this thing supposed to fight a Messerschmitt? Soon, the Thunderbolt earned its infamous nickname, the Jug. Officially short for Juggernaut, but to the pilots, it also looked suspiciously like a milk jug on wings. The name stuck, a mix of affection and mockery. On the ground, mechanics had little affection for it. The turbo supercharger system, Kartveli's engineering masterpiece, was a maintenance nightmare. Its snaking network of ducts, intercoolers, and control valves made troubleshooting a kind of mechanical archaeology. A single misaligned pipe could cause pressure loss, engine surges, or even cockpit fumes that left pilots dizzy mid-flight. Radio interference plagued the early models, forcing ground crews to wrap cables in foil like homegrown antenna experiments. Engines overheated on long climbs. Cockpit canopies jammed. The P-47B was, in short, a beast that didn't want to be tamed.
At first, the pilots didn't trust it. It was too new, too heavy, too complicated. Many longed for the smaller, lighter fighters they had trained in. Some openly joked that if they ever had to bail out, they'd do it before takeoff, because they weren't sure the Jug would ever get off the ground. But then, the first real flights began, and in the air, the story changed. The moment the Jug's landing gear folded into its belly, its personality transformed. The heavy, awkward frame suddenly came alive, solid, stable, and unflinching. The controls were smooth and deliberate. It didn't dance to the sky like a Spitfire, but owned it, carving wide arcs with sheer mass and momentum. Then came the dives. Test pilots soon discovered something startling. The P-47 could dive faster than anything else in the sky. At 20,000 feet, when a pilot pointed the Jug's nose down and opened the throttle, the altimeter spun like a clock gone mad. The air screamed across the fuselage. The wings shuddered, but the aircraft held together. Where German fighters like the Bf-109 or FW-190 risked structural failure beyond 480 miles per hour, the P-47 dove past 500, 550, even 600 miles per hour without disintegrating. The Thunderbolt didn't slice through the air. It plunged through it like a meteor. Its strength came from its weight, its thick skin, its powerful frame, all the things pilots had mocked on the ground. And when it came time to fight, its 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns turned skepticism into awe. A short burst could vaporize an enemy aircraft, cut through armor plating, or tear a train car to pieces. One pilot remembered his first gunnery test. I held the trigger for 2 seconds. When I looked back, there was nothing left of the target, just smoke. Soon, the laughter and complaints on the flight line faded. Pilots who once sneered at the Jug began to brag about its toughness. Mechanics who cursed its complexity grew proud of its reliability. They realized that, though the Thunderbolt wasn't pretty, it was forgiving. It could take hits that would shatter a Spitfire or rip a Mustang in half, and still bring its pilot home. The skeptics were becoming believers. The Jug, once ridiculed as a flying milk bottle, was slowly earning a new reputation. The fighter that wouldn't die.
Part 4, Baptism of Fire. By the spring of 1943, the war in the air had reached a fever pitch. Every day, swarms of American bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, lumbered across the English Channel toward the heart of Nazi Germany. Their mission, cripple the Reich's war machine, one factory at a time. But their escorts, the fighters meant to protect them, could only go so far. Beyond the French coast, the bombers were alone, easy prey for the Luftwaffe's seasoned hunters. Dozens were lost in broad daylight, shredded by cannon fire before ever reaching their targets. The Thunderbolt had been designed to change that. In March 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force deployed its first operational P-47 units to England. Among them was the 56th Fighter Group, commanded by a man whose name would soon become legend, Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke. Zemke was no ordinary officer. He was a tactician, a perfectionist, and above all, a fighter pilot's fighter pilot, confident, sharp-eyed, and utterly fearless. His men called him Zemke the Wolf, and under his leadership, the 56th would soon become known as Zemke's Wolf Pack, a unit as aggressive and relentless as the man himself. But when the first Thunderbolts arrived at their muddy English airfields, enthusiasm quickly gave way to frustration. The P-47C, the first true combat variant, was enormous and temperamental. Radio equipment malfunctioned at altitude, making communication with bomber formations nearly impossible. Fuel systems froze. The complex turbo-supercharger lagged in power response. Worse still, the Thunderbolt's limited range meant that the bombers they were assigned to escort often flew beyond their reach. More than once, Zemke's men watched helplessly as the silver formations of B-17s disappeared into the clouds, leaving the fighters circling, unable to follow. "We couldn't even get to the fight," one pilot recalled. "We'd climb, and by the time we reached the rendezvous point, the bombers were gone." For weeks, the missions were plagued by failure. Frustration grew. Pilots began to wonder if the P-47 was a mistake, a thunderous, overbuilt experiment that couldn't do the one job it was made for. But Zemke wasn't the type to give up. He studied the Thunderbolt's strengths and weaknesses like a predator studying its prey. If it couldn't turn with the enemy, fine. If it couldn't climb as fast, fine. He realized that the Jug's advantages lay elsewhere, in its immense power, structural strength, and dive speed. He rewrote the book on how to fight with it.
No more turning duels. No more slow, circular engagements. Zemke taught his pilots to strike from high altitudes, where the Thunderbolt reigned supreme. They would stalk their enemies from above, diving out of the sun at over 500 miles per hour, firing short, devastating bursts, then using their momentum to climb away before the enemy could react. Hit hard, hit fast, disappear. That was the Wolf Pack way. Once the radio issues were fixed and the pilots mastered their aircraft's temperament, the transformation was immediate and deadly. On April 15, 1943, over Rouen, France, Lieutenant Paul Drew of the 78th Fighter Group achieved the Thunderbolt's first confirmed aerial victory, a Focke Wulf FW-190 torn from the sky in a single high-speed pass. It was a small victory, but it sent ripples through both air forces. For the Americans, it was proof that the Jug could kill. For the Germans, it was the first whisper of a new and terrifying opponent. Soon after, the victories multiplied. Zemke's Wolf Pack began to refine its deadly rhythm, climbing high over northern France, waiting for the enemy to take the bait. When the Luftwaffe rose to intercept the bomber streams, the P-47s fell upon them like thunder. Their dives were unstoppable. Where Messerschmitt Bf 109 risked tearing its wings off beyond 480 miles per hour, the Jug could dive past 600 without structural failure. Its radial engine, shielded by thick armor, kept running even after taking hits that would have destroyed any inline engine fighter. German pilots learned to fear that distinctive silhouette, the wide wings, the blunt nose, the shimmering silver streak that came screaming out of the sun. When you saw that big fighter diving on you, one Luftwaffe ace later admitted, you knew you couldn't outrun it. You just prayed he'd miss. Each encounter taught Zemke's men new lessons in survival and lethality. They learned to trust the Thunderbolt, to use its dive to escape, its firepower to dominate, and its ruggedness to come home alive. In the spring skies of 1943, the Thunderbolt was baptized in fire, and from those early uncertain sorties emerged a revelation. This ungainly, overweight fighter, the one everyone had mocked, was fast becoming one of the deadliest machines in the European sky. The Jug was no longer a joke. It was the beginning of an airborne juggernaut that would soon break the back of the Luftwaffe.
Part 5, The Learning Curve. The early months were brutal. Many Thunderbolts were lost not to enemy fire but to inexperience, pilots misjudging dives, compressing under high speeds, or running out of fuel on the long return trips from France. The P-47 was unlike anything the young American flyers had trained on. She was vast, a 7-ton brood of steel and fire, and to master her required patience, strength, and nerve. But by late 1943, the Americans had adapted. They learned her moods. They discovered that her immense weight could be turned into power, that her dive, once feared, could become a weapon. Pilots began to use the P-47's turbo-supercharger to climb above 30,000 feet, where few German fighters could follow. From that thin, freezing air, they would roll into a dive, engines howling, guns blazing, and rip through enemy formations before the Germans even knew they were there. Major Francis Gabby Gabreski, one of Colonel Hub Zemke's aces, summed up the Jug's nature in his own words: she was big, heavy, and mean. But she could take a hit and bring you home when others couldn't. And she did, again and again. The Thunderbolt's massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 radial engine could shrug off damage that would cripple other aircraft. Pilots came home with entire cylinders shot out, oil pressure gone, and wings shredded by cannon shells, and still, the Jug limped across the channel, smoking and bleeding, to settle onto the runways of England like a wounded bull refusing to fall. Gabreski's 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolf Pack, soon became the terror of the Luftwaffe. Their tactics were relentless: dive, strike, and climb. They hunted in packs, communicating through clipped radio calls and instinct born of trust. Each man knew the other's voice, the sound of his engine, the rhythm of his breathing under stress. The Wolf Pack became a brotherhood forged in steel and sky.
By the spring of 1944, the P-47 had evolved from a misunderstood heavyweight into one of the most feared fighters in Europe. The Germans, who were once mocked as a flying milk jug, now gave it a different name, der Großschlachter, the Big Butcher. Gabreski himself would end the war with 28 confirmed victories, every one of them an AP-47. To him, the Jug wasn't just a machine, it was a companion, a beast that shared his risks and protected his life. She wasn't pretty, he said later. She wasn't fast like a Mustang, but she was ours and she'd fight like hell. As 1944 wore on, the P-51 Mustang began to take over the long-range escort missions, its greater endurance better suited to the deep strikes over Germany. Many Thunderbolt squadrons were re-equipped, their beloved Jugs replaced by the sleeker, newer fighter. Some pilots welcomed the change. Others felt as though they were losing an old friend. Yet the P-47 refused to fade away. She found a new purpose, low-level ground attack. With 8.50 caliber machine guns, rockets, and bombs slung under her wings, the Jug became a flying hammer, smashing German convoys, rail lines, and armored columns during the push from Normandy to the Rhine. On the ground, soldiers came to revere the sound of her engine. When you heard that deep growl overhead, one infantryman later recalled, you knew the Jug was coming, and you knew you were going to live another day. By war's end, more than 15,000 Thunderbolts had been built, serving in every theater from Europe to the Pacific. She had carried thousands of young men into battle, and when luck and armor allowed, brought them home again. And when the war finally ended, when the airfields fell silent and the skies over Europe cleared, many pilots stood beside their Jugs one last time, resting a hand on the cool metal of the cowling. For them, she was more than an airplane. She was survival, courage, and memory, forged in fire and thunder.
Part 6, The Turning Tide. By the dawn of 1944, the war in the skies over Europe had become a campaign of annihilation. Every morning, the thunder of engines rolled across the English countryside as waves of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators lifted off from misty airfields, bound for targets deep within the heart of the Third Reich. Their mission, to shatter Germany's industrial core, its oil plants, its aircraft factories, its rail lines. But the deeper the bombers went, the greater the danger became. Beyond the Rhine River, over cities like Hanover, Brunswick, and eventually Berlin, the Luftwaffe still ruled the skies. The Americans had the numbers, but the Germans had experience, and they fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland. For the bomber crews, it was a daily nightmare. Flak bursts filled the sky like black flowers, and packs of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke Wulf Fw-190s attacked from every angle. Dozens of bombers went down in flames each mission. The Thunderbolt, powerful though it was, simply couldn't escort the bombers that far. Its massive engine devoured fuel, and without additional tanks, its range ended somewhere near the western border of Germany. Beyond that line, the bombers were on their own. Until someone had an idea. The solution was simple in theory, ingenious in execution: external fuel tanks, drop tanks, hung beneath the Jug's wings. With those, the Thunderbolt's range stretched dramatically. What had once been a 200-mile escort radius suddenly doubled, then tripled. Now, for the first time, the heavy American fighter could stay with the bomber formations all the way to the German capital itself, to Berlin. It was a game changer. In early 1944, when the 8th Air Force began its massive daylight raids on Berlin and Leipzig, the Luftwaffe expected another easy harvest. But what they found instead were Thunderbolts waiting for them, fast, high, and angry. The pilots of the Luftwaffe soon realized something terrible: their own tactics no longer worked.
The Thunderbolts' slashing dives from altitude were devastating. They came screaming out of the sun, guns blazing, then pulled away in a climb the Germans couldn't match. A formation of Fw-190s that had once confidently attacked bombers was now ripped apart in seconds, burning wrecks tumbling through the clouds. Those who survived often never saw their attacker again. The Jug appeared and vanished like a bolt of lightning. There, then gone. They hit us like a storm, recalled a German veteran. One moment, the sky was clear. The next, there were Thunderbolts everywhere. The numbers told the same story. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe's losses were catastrophic. Entire fighter wings were being ground to dust. The Germans could replace their aircraft, but not their pilots. Meanwhile, the P-47's reputation soared. To bomber crews, it became a guardian angel. The sight of those broad wings and distinctive round noses meant salvation. To ground troops, it became a symbol of American dominance, a living embodiment of industrial might and relentless firepower. And to the enemy, it became a harbinger of death. Zemke's Wolfpack and other elite groups, the 78th, 353rd, 352nd, and 361st Fighter Groups, perfected the art of fighter sweeps, racing ahead of the bombers to clear the skies of opposition. The tactic worked brutally well. Entire squadrons of Luftwaffe fighters were ambushed before they even reached altitude. Airfields were strafed, hangars destroyed, runways cratered. The Thunderbolt was no longer a defensive escort. It had become a hunter. As the months passed, its kill count soared into the hundreds. The Wolfpack alone would eventually rack up over 665 confirmed aerial victories, the highest of any P-47 group in the European theater. And yet, even as it dominated the air, the Jug's legend was just beginning, because Kartvelli's creation had another gift to offer: sheer survivability. Pilots who limp home with half their control surfaces missing, oil pressure gone, or holes the size of basketballs in their wings learned to trust one truth above all: the Thunderbolt could take it. Time and again, Jugs returned to base riddled with cannon shells, their engines coughing, their fuselages torn open, and still they landed. If you want to get home, 1A said, "Take a Jug." By mid-1944, the laughter that had greeted the Thunderbolt's arrival was long gone. The Luftwaffe's veterans, the same men who once mocked it as slow and clumsy, now dreaded its shadow. They had a name for it, whispered over the radio in clipped, tense German: Donnerkiel, the Thunderbolt.
Part 7, The Jug Strikes Back. By late 1944, the skies over Europe belonged to the Allies. The Luftwaffe, once the most formidable air arm in the world, had been bled dry. Its fuel reserves were vanishing, its pilots barely trained, its factories reduced to rubble by the very bombers it had once hunted. But for the P-47 Thunderbolt, the war was far from over. With German air power collapsing, the mission of the U.S. Army Air Forces began to shift. The bombers still flew, but now the true battle lay below, in the shattered towns, forests, and fields of occupied Europe. The Allied armies were advancing, and they needed air power that could fight close to the ground. And in that brutal, mud-choked arena, the Thunderbolt was reborn. A new role for a relentless machine. The Jug was already famous for its size, its strength, and its survivability, but those same traits made it the perfect fighter bomber. Its thick armor plate shielded the pilot from small arms fire and flak fragments. Its air-cooled radial engine could take direct hits that would instantly cripple a liquid-cooled Mustang or Spitfire. And with 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, it could unleash a hurricane of lead, nearly 13 rounds per second from each gun, a storm of bullets that could tear through anything short of a fortress. Loaded with 500 and 1,000-pound bombs, or racks of HVAR rockets, the Jug became the hammer of the Allied advance. In the summer of 1944, as the first troops stormed ashore in Normandy, Thunderbolts roared overhead. They weren't just fighting the Luftwaffe anymore, they were hunting the German army itself. The scourge of German armor. From the beaches to the hedgerows, the P-47 became the terror of the Wehrmacht. Flying at treetop level, pilots strafed convoys, trains, and columns of tanks with deadly precision. They struck bridges, rail yards, and ammunition dumps, turning the roads of northern France into twisted graveyards of steel. Smoke and fire marked their path. Wherever the Thunderbolt flew, destruction followed. One German officer, interviewed years later, put it bluntly: "When we saw the Jugs, we knew the day was lost." To the American infantry below, the sight and sound of the Thunderbolt was a source of hope. Its arrival meant the difference between retreat and survival. "You could hear them coming before you saw them," recalled one U.S. soldier. That deep, growling engine, then the tracers raining down. When the Jug showed up, we knew we were going to make it through the day.
Normandy, the Falaise Pocket, and beyond. During the Normandy campaign, P-47s played a decisive role in cutting off German reinforcements and trapping the retreating Panzer divisions in the Falaise Pocket. Thousands of vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, were annihilated from the air. The French countryside burned under the relentless assault of rockets and machine gun fire. The Jug's pilots became hunters. They flew from dawn until dusk, sometimes making 6 or 7 sorties a day, each time diving through flak and smoke, so thick they could taste it. The odds were brutal. Low-level flak claimed many Thunderbolts, but the aircraft's ruggedness gave its pilots a fighting chance. Stories spread to the squadrons of jugs limping home on one cylinder, wings shredded, oil pouring from cracked cowls, and still managing to land. No other fighter in the Allied inventory could take such punishment and survive. The Winter War, the Ardennes Offensive, when Hitler launched his last desperate counterattack in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge, the P-47 was once again at the front, through snow, fog, and bitter cold. Thunderbolts scoured the forests, attacking convoys hidden under trees, smashing tanks, and isolating German spearheads. When the weather cleared, the result was catastrophic for Germans. P-47 squadrons dove in waves, turning roads into killing fields. Tanks erupted like volcanoes under direct hits from rockets and 500-pound bombs. The Luftwaffe's last efforts to intervene were swept aside. By 1945, even hardened German troops refer to any Allied airstrike simply as the Jugs. A legend forged in smoke and fire, the Thunderbolt had begun the war as a misunderstood giant, mocked for its bulk, doubted for its agility. Now, it was the most feared ground attack aircraft in Europe. A single P-47 could obliterate a column of tanks, devastate a train yard, or silence an artillery battery in one pass. And when it ran out of rockets or bombs, it simply turned its guns on whatever was left. Its legacy was written in craters and wreckage, in the blackened husks of panzers, the shattered remains of rail cars, the silence that followed its thunder. By the war's end, Thunderbolt pilots had destroyed over 86,000 ground targets, tanks, locomotives, vehicles, bridges, and gun positions, and claimed thousands of aerial victories. The Jug had done what no one expected. It fought 2 wars at once, one in the skies and one on the ground, and won them both.
Part 8, The Beast of the Battlefield. By 1945, the P-47 was everywhere, from the frozen skies of northern Europe to the humid jungles of the Pacific and the sun-baked fields of Italy. Wherever the United States Army Air Forces fought, the deep roar of the Jug's Pratt & Whitney engine was never far behind. In Europe alone, Thunderbolts accounted for more than 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, and thousands more obliterated on the ground. Rail yards, bridges, fuel depots, convoys, tanks, nothing was safe once the Jugs descended. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the continent, found itself outnumbered, outgunned, and outflown. The men who flew her became legends. Francis Gabby Gabreski, Robert S. Johnson, David Schilling, Hubert Zemke, Neil Kirby, names that echoed across airfields and mess halls like the heroes of an ancient epic. Each carved his own legacy in gunfire and courage, Gabreski's daring precision strikes, Johnson's miraculous survivals, Kirby's blazing attacks in the Pacific skies. Together, they defined what it meant to fly the Thunderbolt. But the real legend wasn't just in the men, it was in the machine. The P-47 earned a reputation unlike any other, the plane that brought its pilots home. Even when riddled with bullets, leaking oil, or missing half a wing, the Jug refused to die. Time and again, pilots returned to base in aircraft that should have been scrap metal. Ground crews would watch in disbelief as Thunderbolts staggered in on one engine cylinder, gear refusing to drop, wings peppered with flak and cannon holes large enough to crawl through. Mechanics counted hundreds of bullet strikes on the fuselage, yet the aircraft had still made it home.
Robert S. Johnson's story became legend among them. In June 1943, his P-47 was shredded by a Focke Wulf 190. Canopy jammed, oil spewing, controls half dead. The German ace circled him, certain the American would bail out, but Johnson held on. The Jug kept flying. When the enemy finally ran out of ammunition and peeled away, Johnson limped back across the channel, landing safely. The mechanics counted 21 cannon hits and more than 200 smaller holes. The aircraft was ruined, but alive, just like its pilot. It was moments like that which cemented the Thunderbolt's myth. To the men who flew her, she wasn't just a tool of war. She was a partner, a guardian, a brute with a heart of steel. As the Allies pushed into Germany, the Jug became the hammer of the battlefield. Flying low and fast, her 8.50 caliber machine gun spat destruction across columns of German armor, shredding convoys and crippling the Wehrmacht's last desperate defenses. Armed with bombs and rockets, the P-47 became a flying artillery piece, roaring through valleys and over rivers to strike targets the ground forces couldn't reach. Infantrymen came to recognize her instantly. That deep, throaty growl in the distance, followed by the thunderclap of guns and the scream of rockets. When you saw the Jug coming in, one soldier recalled, you dropped flat and smiled, because it meant the bad guys were about to have a really bad day. By the end of the war, the P-47 had flown over 500,000 combat sorties. It had proven itself in every role: high-altitude escort, low-level attacker, bomber-killer, and tank buster. It was the most produced American fighter of the war, and arguably the toughest. When peace finally came, thousands of Thunderbolts sat silent on airfields across Europe and the Pacific, their engines cooling, their wings streaked with the grime of battle. Many would be sold, scrapped, or sent to foreign air forces. But for the men who had flown them, the Jug would never be just another airplane. She was the beast of the battlefield, massive, loud, unbreakable, and loyal to the very end.
Part 9, The Legacy of Thunder. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world looked to the skies and saw a new era dawning. The sleek, long-legged P-51 Mustang had become the darling of the air war, escorting bombers deep into Germany and earning the glory of the final victories. The future, it seemed, belonged to speed and elegance, to the jet age. And soon, the P-80 Shooting Star appeared on the horizon, its smooth fuselage and turbine whine heralding a new chapter in aviation. In the glow of those new machines, the P-47 Thunderbolt, big, loud, and unapologetically brute, began to fade from public view. But among those who had flown her, those who had lived and bled inside her metal skin, the Jug's legend never dimmed. They remembered her not for grace or beauty, but for something deeper. For loyalty. For strength. For the way she brought them home when nothing else could. The pilot's fighter. Ask any man who flew the Thunderbolt, and you'd hear the same tone in their voice, a mix of pride, affection, and disbelief that such a beast could have ever taken flight. She was heavy on the controls. She burned fuel like a furnace. She didn't turn, she charged. But she would take punishment that no other aircraft could survive. There were stories, endless stories, of pilots coming back with half a wing missing, engines shredded by flak, control cables shot away, and still managing to land. Of ground crews counting hundreds of bullet holes in a Jug's fuselage as the pilot climbed out, exhausted but alive. To them, the P-47 wasn't just an aircraft. It was a promise that no matter how bad the mission went, no matter how fierce the fight, it would give them a chance to live through it. As one ace later said, if you want to get kills, fly a Mustang. If you want to get home, fly a Jug. Brute strength in flight. The P-47 was never elegant. It was brute strength turned into flight, an airplane that looked more like an engine with wings than a fighter. Its lines were thick, its stance aggressive, the very opposite of aerodynamic grace. Yet somehow, in its rawness, it became something greater. It was a triumph of American engineering and industrial will, a symbol of a nation that had entered the war underestimated, untested, and uncertain, and emerged unstoppable. The Thunderbolt was America itself in aluminum form, loud, stubborn, resilient, and unstoppable when pushed.
From the laughter of German pilots who once mocked its shape, to the terror it inspired in the final years of the war, the Jug story mirrored that of a country that built it. Underestimated at first, invincible in the end. The Germans laughed at her, one veteran recalled, until her 8.50s rained lead on them. After the storm, when peace returned, the P-47 was quickly replaced by jets and newer designs. Many were scrapped or sold overseas. Some flew on in South America and Asia, carrying the scars of another war into the skies of the Cold War's forgotten fronts. But wherever they went, they carried with them the same reputation, for power, for toughness, for survival. And for those who had once heard the deep growl of its Pratt & Whitney R-2800, that sound would never be forgotten. It wasn't a hum or a whine. It was a roar, deep and elemental, like thunder rolling across a battlefield. It was the sound of the Jug, the Thunderbolt, the flying anvil that turned the tide of the air war in Europe. Epilogue. Today, only a few Thunderbolts remain, lovingly restored and kept alive by enthusiasts and historians. When their engines start, crowds still turn to watch, drawn by that same raw power that once shook the skies over France and Germany. They stand as reminders of a time when victory was measured in courage, and survival depended on steel, skill, and luck. The P-47 never wore the crown of beauty or fame, but earned something greater: respect. It was a fighter that wouldn't die, the guardian of the bombers, the scourge of German armor, and the unbreakable Jug that thundered through history. And in every roar of its engine, even now, echoes the same truth: Strength wins wars. And the Thunderbolt was strength-made wings.
Part 10, Epilogue, The Sound of Thunder. Today, only a few dozen Thunderbolts still fly. But when one of those massive engines coughs to life, the propeller slicing the air, the exhaust booming like distant artillery, every head turns. The deep, throaty roar of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 fills the air, rolling across the tarmac like a memory come alive. And for a moment, it's 1944 again. Pilots, veterans, and dreamers alike feel it, that shiver down the spine, that instinctive pull of history. The sound isn't just noise, it's the voice of another time, when courage had wings and steel had a soul. Each surviving jug carries the weight of thousands that came before, those that never returned from France or the Ardennes, from the skies over Italy or the steaming jungles of New Guinea. When a Thunderbolt lifts off today, it carries with it the spirit of those who once trusted their lives to its armor and its thunder. Restored with care and reverence, the remaining P-47s gleam under museum lights or tear through the skies at airshows, leaving long trails of smoke that seem to write history itself across the heavens. Spectators look up, hands shielding their eyes, as the silver beast passes overhead. Some smile. Others grow quiet. Because in that roar lives a story, of youth, of fear, of valor. It's the echo of an era when courage met machinery. When men climbed into monsters of steel and trusted their fate to horsepower and instinct. When air combat was raw and personal, a duel measured in seconds and inches, where one mistake could mean never coming home. And through all of it, one misunderstood giant, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, rose from doubt to legend. What began as a clumsy brute became one of the most formidable aircraft ever built, rewriting the rules of aerial warfare and proving that strength, resilience, and sheer will could triumph over speed or grace. Today, as the last of the Thunderbolts thunder down runways around the world, they remind us of something timeless, that greatness isn't always beautiful, and that legends aren't always born sleek or elegant. Sometimes, they're forged in smoke, oil, and noise. The P-47 Thunderbolt. Heavy, loud, unstoppable. A legend forged in thunder.